Hello,
Uh,
pizza,
this Uber Eats?
pizza.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Pizza time.
Hi, is this Mike's small group?
Yeah, I'm Mike.
Okay.
This is our Cole Harbor small group. Thank you for bringing pizza. Come on in. Come in. And here's our
Pizza.
Hey, welcome everyone to Small Group. It's good to be with you. This is Nick.
Hi. Hello. Good to see you. Oh, it's
I don't
very
know why
abrupt.
that's so
I,
funny
I
to
don't.
me.
I.
Your level
It was
of
a little too.
enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Oh my
Hello.
goodness.
Nice
This
to
is
see
Nick,
you all.
everyone, and this is the energy he's bringing to this conversation. We're in week 7 of a series through the Gospel according to Mark. If you're new to faith, you're new to church, you're new to small group, this is a great series because we're exploring who Jesus is, what Jesus invites us into as his followers, and we're going to read the scripture from Sunday in a little bit. The purpose of this video is to do a bit of a recap for Sunday's message in case you weren't there or just for a refresher. And so we'll read the text, but I want to remind you of the structure of the message. Here's the 3 things Nick and I talked about. We talked about what is the Sabbath, because this is a story. We studied the story about Jesus having a controversy around the Sabbath.
Right.
Well, that's a new term for some of us. What is the Sabbath? We talked about that. Why was Jesus, this is the second thing, why was Jesus in controversies over the Sabbath with the religious leaders? And then 3, the third thing, why should the Sabbath matter to us today? And so those are the 3 things. And what is the Sabbath, Nick? Why don't you give us that refresher?
Well, we kind of have covered this if you've been with us. We did a series on the 10 Commandments where
Yes.
we delved in and studied the Sabbath. So, a quick recap. The Sabbath was, at the time the Sabbath command was given, it was a 24-hour period from Friday night to Saturday night. It was a day of the week that was supposed to be set apart, different than the rest of the days that you worked on. It was a day to enter the rest that God wanted for his people. And it was one day a week that Israel was to remember and make holy. And what's interesting is that it was time. The first thing that God made holy was time. Sabbath is holy time. It's set apart time, sacred time, and it goes all the way back to the first creation account in Genesis where God rests.
Yeah.
He takes up residence in his temple, in his creation, and rests. God blesses the work of his hands on the 7th day, and he rests. Then he commands Israel to rest as well.
So a Friday to Saturday, a day of rest, labor ceases for everyone. It is a beautiful idea, this day to enjoy the fruit of your labor, as God did when he rested.
Right.
A day to remind yourself that God is holding the world together, not you. A day to trust that God is sovereign over creation, that God doesn't sleep or slumber, so you can. And if you stop, not all things will fall apart, because God is actually the one holding all things together. To rest, to pause, reminds our hearts of that reality. And so there's so many beautiful lessons that the Sabbath ingrained in the life and the faith tradition of Israel. And it continues to this day, and it continued right up to the time of Jesus.
Right.
The Sabbath was still a big thing. And Jesus in his ministry would get into conflicts with the religious leaders around the Sabbath.
Yeah, which leads to our second point about Jesus having conflict with the Pharisees and why this was so significant. And what's interesting is there seems to be a growing conflict as we've been in the book of Mark. First, Jesus forgives sins, which the Pharisees they didn't like that very much. And then he eats with sinners, which they also didn't like very much. But what pushes them over the edge to the point where they plot his murder is when he starts messing around with the Sabbath command or the commands that they set up around the Sabbath. So,
Yeah. I'm going to read the text.
yeah.
But let me just pause and mention 2 things I'm noticing about this experience.
Whoa.
1, you're very prepared.
Well,
2, your computer is a little bit nicer than mine.
Really?
You take better
I
care of
did
it.
just wipe the screen off yesterday,
That
actually.
is what it is.
So that's probably
I'm
normally
looking at this and I'm like, man,
no,
this guy.
normally it would have smudges all over it, but I just wiped it
Okay.
recently. So,
It's just impressive.
yeah.
So let me read the text. This is also a scripture you might read again in your group, but this is the one we focused on We actually read 2 scriptures on the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
The second one, Jesus heals someone on the Sabbath, and that really makes them angry.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just going to read the first interaction here. This is Mark chapter 2, verse 23 to 28. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisee said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did?" This is King David, when he was hungry, or he and his companions were hungry and in need. In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, this is a big claim, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, there's the phrase again he uses, is Lord even of the Sabbath. What's fascinating about that response is we sometimes read the Gospel of Mark and say, well, Jesus doesn't really say he's God, because he doesn't come out and just say, I am God with skin on. But when he does stuff like this, everyone in his day goes, who does this guy think he is? The Lord of the Sabbath. And so let's just get into the context a bit more here.
It's pretty controversial because in this first instance, which you read so wonderfully, the disciples are gathering grain, and farmers at the time were actually commanded in the Old Testament law that they allowed people to harvest grain if they were hungry, but not on the Sabbath. And you weren't allowed to reap on the Sabbath. There were like 39 forbidden activities you weren't allowed to do on the Sabbath. You weren't allowed to like tie or untie a knot. But what the disciples were doing here technically wasn't reaping, because they weren't using the sheaves to reap them off. But for the Pharisees, it was close enough, right? So this is why they criticized Jesus. And Jesus responds to the leaders' criticism by citing the life of King David.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting citation. And on Sunday, you can listen to the podcast, but we go more into it and some of the details around it. But there's a few things that Jesus is doing with this reference that are pretty interesting. I think one, he's identifying with King David, who had this special prerogative. Scripture doesn't condemn what King David did in that instance. And I think it's Jesus hinting at his messianic identity as in the line of King David, as Israel's long-awaited rescuer. He's claiming special prerogative for himself. He does it very clearly at the end where he says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. But I also think he's doing something that's really important for us to grasp, that he's hinting at this principle that human need and compassion can supersede or override ritual requirements. And the Pharisees weren't having it. And part of it has to do with their different view on the law and the rules they made around the law. You know, like you're not to work on Sabbath. What is work? And they made up all these extra rules that Jesus didn't always follow. But I'll read a quote. I haven't done this in a while, and I'm hoping that Alex will
Put it up.
just put it up there. But it's up to him.
Do you want it to take up the whole screen when he does
I don't
it?
know. I mean, he's a lot of creative license.
he knows what to do.
Experienced in recent weeks. He knows. But I'll read you this quote. It says, as one scholar notes, for the Pharisees, the law had become the means to establishing a national identity of purity and rectitude in an effort to move God to bring the day of salvation nearer. If we're just careful to follow the law and all the rules we've made up around the law, then God will come back and restore his kingdom and it will be good. And because of this, observance of the law became a burden. God's gracious instruction now became a restrictive and heavy burden, transformed into principles that have become more important than people. That their rules around the Sabbath became more important than human compassion, which is why they're so angry when Jesus heals someone on the Sabbath, illustrating really one of the deeper purposes of Sabbath, healing, freedom, restoration. And so Jesus doesn't follow their rules, though he fulfills and obeys God's command. And he has this brilliant response.
He says, man was not made for Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. And I love this because Jesus doesn't try and debate the Pharisees over whether they actually broke the Sabbath law or not. Instead, he's like redirecting them towards what Sabbath was always intended to be about. Sabbath was created for us. It was not man was not made for the Sabbath. Sabbath is not to be a burden. It's meant to be a blessing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's meant to bring freedom and life. And Jesus, he clears away all the extra tape around Sabbath that had turned from a blessing into a burden. And it's why Jesus is so upset even in the second instance that we weren't able to get to, because the religious leaders were more concerned about making sure that they didn't break the rules and the laws instead of bringing life and healing. And more than anything, a breaking of this religious Sabbath law stirs up murderous intent, right, from the Pharisees. And they actually conspire, as we read at the end, they conspire with the Herodians to plot to kill Jesus.
There's almost like three groups emerging at this point in the Gospel of Mark. There was the crowd that's curious. Then there's the called and the committed who follow. And now there's this growing third group of like hostility and animosity, and Mark's building that tension through the narrative and through the stories he's selecting. And so the third thing we talked about is, why does the Sabbath matter for us? And I mentioned John Mark Comer in his teaching on solitude, where he talks about, you know him personally?
Of him? I've shook his hand, I think.
Shook his hand?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How is that? Would you say that he moisturizes? Would you say he's got the hand of a lumberjack? Or does he type a lot?
I can't remember.
You can't remember. Okay. I've had people on Sundays go, wow, your hands are soft.
Your hands?
Yeah.
Oh.
And there's people I've known.
Yeah. Right.
But I've also felt like, should they not? Anyways, it's irrelevant to what we're talking about here. Maybe we cut that out, Alex. But John Mark Comer, in his teaching on solitude, talks about three kinds of tiredness. Okay, there's like healthy tiredness, where you work hard, and your body's tired, but your soul's still alive, and you're doing things that are meaningful. And then there's like unhealthy tiredness, where you're not sleeping enough. There's real stress. You can handle it, but you're starting to fray around the edges.
Been there.
And then there's dangerous tiredness, where you're disconnected from God, disconnected from your truest self. And you get in situations where you start being frightened by your reactions. You go, oh man, I'm really not connected with the Lord, with others, with who I feel called to be. It's a dangerous tiredness. And it's good to reflect on where we are and how Sabbath speaks into that picture.
Yeah.
Because, you go.
I was just going to reflect on what you were saying.
Go ahead.
Sabbath becomes like an invitation. Right.
An invitation to rest, to be refreshed, to restore yourself. If you're healthy tired, it brings you back to a place of like, I'm ready to go. If you're unhealthy tired, it can at least reveal that and be one of the rhythms or patterns you incorporate into your life to restore you to a sense of health.
Right.
And then if you're dangerously tired, it can expose that as well and reveal what needs to change. And so rest, Sabbath can keep us healthy, restore us to health, reveal how dangerously unhealthy we are. And the reality is we need rest for our bodies and our souls, but it's more than just a day off, because you can take a day off and feel agitated and annoyed if we don't address the underlying reason why we're always working. If we're working to justify our worth, to justify our lives, like existentially, we can feel tired and agitated even when we are resting. And so Sabbath is a deeper pointer into the rest we can find in Jesus as his followers. Jesus who says in the Gospel of Matthew, come to me all who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. And so I'm going to throw it to them. And there's lots to talk about from the scripture, from this recap. And I think one of the things you will talk about is how to engage rhythms of Sabbath rest. You might talk about where you are on this spectrum of good tired, unhealthy tired, or dangerously tired. And then maybe about how the good news of Jesus gives us the ability to rest well, and to stop striving so much to prove we matter, to prove we're valuable, to prove we're worth something, which is really the reason why many of us can't stop and can't rest.
Right. That's good.
So we'll throw to you now, Nick. Thanks
for having me.
Okay.
Peace.
Pizza.